St. Mary's Hospital had long been a cornerstone of the small town, standing for over a century as a beacon of care and hope. Recently, the hospital underwent extensive renovations, transforming the old, decaying building into a state-of-the-art medical facility. The once crumbling walls were now pristine, painted in a sterile white that reflected the harsh fluorescent lights above. New floors gleamed, the smell of fresh paint and disinfectant lingering in the air, masking the building's sordid history. The townspeople were proud of their new hospital, unaware that the renovations had merely covered up the sinister past rather than erased it. Sarah Mitchell, a nurse who had just started her night shift, couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As she walked the freshly polished corridors, the silence seemed too heavy, as if the walls were absorbing the sound rather than reflecting it. The hum of the hospital's machinery, usually a comforting presence, felt more like a distant, ominous drone that set her on edge. The other nurses had spoken in hushed tones about odd occurrences since the reopening, but Sarah had dismissed them as nerves. After all, she was a professional, trained to deal with the tangible realities of life and death, not ghost stories. It was around 2:30 a.m. when Sarah first heard it. She was making her rounds on the third floor when a faint sound reached her ears, something that didn't belong. She paused, straining to hear. The sound was barely audible at first, a soft, indistinct murmur. She shook her head, blaming her fatigue. But as she continued down the hallway, the murmur grew clearer, becoming a whisper, a voice, low and mournful, echoing through the hall. It was coming from the direction of the basement. "Help me." The voice was so weak, so desperate, that for a moment, Sarah's rational mind couldn't comprehend it. Her heart pounded in her chest as the words sank in. She looked around, hoping to see someone else who might have heard it too, but the hallway was empty. She was alone. The basement was supposed to be locked up for the night, a place where no one should be at this hour. Yet, the voice seemed to be pleading, begging for release from some unseen torment. The fear began to creep in, slowly at first, like a cold breath on the back of her neck. Sarah's grip tightened on the metal chart in her hands, her knuckles turning white. Her instincts told her to turn back, to get away from whatever was down there. But curiosity, or perhaps some deeper compulsion, urged her to move forward. She found herself standing at the top of the stairs leading to the basement, staring down into the darkness below. The whisper came again, louder this time, as if it was aware of her presence. "Please help me." A shiver ran down Sarah's spine. She reached for the light switch by the door, but the basement lights flickered weakly, casting long, eerie shadows that danced across the walls. Her breath hitched as she stared into the gloom, trying to convince herself that the voice was just her imagination, a trick played by the fatigue of a long shift. But deep down, she knew it wasn't. Something was down there, something that shouldn't be. She took a step back, the rational part of her brain finally winning out. This wasn't something she was equipped to handle. She turned and quickly walked away, her footsteps echoing through the empty corridor. But even as she retreated, she couldn't shake the feeling that the whispering voice had been meant for her alone, a personal plea from the darkness below. The thought of what might be lurking in the basement haunted her for the rest of the night. And as she left the hospital at dawn, the whispers still echoed in her mind, planting the first seeds of terror that would soon engulf everyone at St. Mary's. The rumors about the whispers spread quickly through the hospital, carried by frightened staff who couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong. Whispers in the corridors, strange noises after dark. These were things that unsettled even the most seasoned employees. But Dr. Michael Turner, the hospital's head of surgery, dismissed it all as mere superstition. A man of science, he had little patience for ghost stories. To him, the voices were nothing more than the byproducts of an overactive imagination, fueled by late-night shifts and lingering anxiety from the hospital's renovations. Determined to put an end to the rumors, Michael decided to investigate the basement himself, convinced that once he proved there was nothing to fear, the staff would return to their duties with renewed focus. It was a quiet night when Michael made his way to the basement. The hospital was eerily still, the silence broken only by the occasional beep of medical equipment and the distant sound of a patient's restless movement. As he approached the door leading to the basement stairs, he felt a slight unease, an unusual sensation for a man who had seen his share of death and suffering in the operating room. He shrugged it off, attributing it to the cold draft that seemed to emanate from the basement, as if the air down there was somehow different, stagnant. He pulled out his flashlight and unlocked the door with a key from his pocket. The door creaked open, revealing a steep, narrow staircase that descended into darkness. The smell of damp and mold hit him immediately, an unpleasant reminder of the basement's age and disuse. As he started down the stairs, the sound of his footsteps echoed off the concrete walls, each step amplifying the growing tension in the air. When he reached the bottom, he paused to take in his surroundings. The basement was a stark contrast to the rest of the hospital. It was dark and foreboding, the walls covered in peeling paint and old stains that told stories of a forgotten past. The renovations hadn't touched this place. It was as if it had been deliberately left out, sealed off from the rest of the world. Michael swept his flashlight across the room, revealing rows of old storage boxes, rusted equipment, and cobweb-covered furniture. Then he heard it, a whisper, faint but unmistakable, drifting through the stale air. "Get out!" The words were barely audible, like a breath carried on a dying wind. Michael froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The sound didn't belong in a place like this. It was too human, too full of emotion to be dismissed as just the building settling. The voice was disembodied, echoing from somewhere deep within the basement, yet it felt as though it was right beside him. He turned, his flashlight beam shaking slightly as he scanned the room again. "Who's there?" he called out, his voice firm but edged with unease. No answer came, just the oppressive silence that seemed to press down on him. Michael took a deep breath, forcing himself to move forward. He wouldn't be scared off by a trick of the mind. He was a surgeon, a man who had spent years confronting the fragility of life. A dark basement and a few strange noises weren't going to intimidate him. He moved deeper into the basement, the flashlight beam flickering as it passed over shadowy corners. The whispers grew more frequent, each one seeming to come from a different direction. "Help us! Leave! Why did you let us die?" The voices overlapped, a chorus of despair and anger that gnawed at Michael's rationality. He tried to locate the source, but it was impossible. The whispers were everywhere, surrounding him, closing in. The flashlight flickered again, then went out entirely, plunging the basement into pitch darkness. Michael cursed under his breath, shaking the flashlight in a futile attempt to restore the light. The darkness was complete, thick and suffocating, as if the basement walls were closing in on him. Panic began to claw at his mind. He was a man of logic, but logic had no place in this oppressive blackness. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, their words becoming clearer and more desperate. "Save us. You can't leave. You're one of us now." A cold dread settled in his chest, different from any fear he had ever known. It wasn't just the darkness or the voices. It was the feeling that he was no longer alone, that something was there with him, watching, waiting. The temperature dropped suddenly, and he could see his breath in the dim light as it briefly returned. The flashlight blinked back on for just a moment, enough to illuminate the vague outline of a figure in the distance, something standing still in the shadows, barely visible. He blinked, and the light went out again. The figure was gone. Michael's breath quickened, and he stumbled back, his thoughts racing. This wasn't possible. None of this was possible. He turned, desperately trying to find the stairs, but in the dark, everything felt disorienting. The whispers turned into a cacophony, growing louder, as if the walls themselves were screaming at him. He ran, his hands outstretched, trying to feel his way through the dark. His fingers brushed against cold, clammy walls as he fumbled blindly for the door. When he finally found the staircase, he practically threw himself up the steps, each footfall echoing in the void below. The whispers followed him, growing fainter as he neared the top, but they didn't stop. They continued to call out, pleading and accusing, until he burst through the door, slamming it shut behind him. Michael stood there, panting, drenched in sweat. The hallway was quiet, the hospital peaceful once more, but the terror lingered, gnawing at the edges of his sanity. He had always prided himself on his logical mind, But there was nothing logical about what he had just experienced. The darkness, the voices, they were real as anything he had ever encountered in the operating room. But they were also something else, something he couldn't explain or understand. He staggered back to his office, locking the door behind him as if that could keep the terror at bay. For the first time in his career, Dr. Michael Turner found himself questioning everything he knew. The whispers in the basement were no mere superstition. They were a warning, a dark secret buried beneath the hospital's gleaming facade, waiting to be uncovered. And they had just begun to make themselves heard. The atmosphere in St. Mary's Hospital grew tense in the days following Dr. Turner's terrifying experience in the basement. Though he tried to keep the incident to himself, the subtle shift in his demeanor didn't go unnoticed by the staff. The once confident, unflappable surgeon now seemed distracted, his thoughts elsewhere, his eyes constantly darting toward the basement door whenever he passed by. Word spread quickly, feeding the growing unease among the nurses and doctors. Something was wrong, and the whispers had become more than just a rumor. They were now an undeniable part of the hospital's darkening reality. Driven by fear and curiosity, a small group of hospital employees began to dig into the history of St. Mary's, desperate to understand the source of the strange occurrences. Among them was Lisa Thompson, a young nurse who had joined the hospital shortly before the renovation. Lisa was naturally skeptical of the paranormal, but the intensity of the whispers and the growing paranoia among her colleagues made her reconsider. She found herself drawn into the investigation, driven by a need to uncover the truth, no matter how horrifying it might be. The group gathered one evening in the hospital's break room, where the dim lighting and the sterile, quiet surroundings amplified the tension. John, the elderly janitor who had worked at St. Mary's for decades, was the first to speak. His voice was low, raspy, as if the weight of his memories was pressing down on him. "There are things this hospital was built to hide," John began, his gaze distant as he recalled events long buried in the past. Long before the renovation, St. Mary's was a place of suffering, a place where unspeakable things were done in the name of medicine. The others leaned in, their attention rapt as John continued. He spoke of the hospital's early days, when it had been a small, struggling facility on the outskirts of town. In those years, the hospital had been little more than a collection of dimly lit rooms, filled with patients suffering from all manner of ailments. The doctors, overwhelmed and underfunded, were desperate to find cures, to make a name for themselves in the medical community. But desperation can lead to darkness. Back then, John said, there was a doctor, Dr. Jonathan Reed. He was brilliant, ambitious, but he was also twisted. Reed was obsessed with the idea of cheating death, of finding a way to prolong life indefinitely. He believed the answers lay in the human mind and body, but his experiments, they were monstrous. The group sat in stunned silence as John detailed the horrors that had occurred in the basement of St. Mary's. Dr. Reed had conducted a series of grotesque experiments on the hospital's most vulnerable patients, those who were too weak, too poor, or too mentally unwell to resist. Under the guise of treatment, Reed subjected them to torturous procedures designed to unlock the secrets of life and death. He probed their brains, injected them with experimental drugs, and exposed them to inhumane conditions, all in the name of science. Many of the patients never left the basement. Those who survived were irreparably damaged, their minds shattered, their bodies broken. Their pleas for mercy, their cries of pain, were ignored, lost in the dark, damp corridors of the hospital's underbelly. And when they finally died, their bodies were unceremoniously disposed of, buried in unmarked graves, or incinerated to erase any trace of the atrocities committed. John's voice trembled as he spoke of the diary he had found hidden in one of the walls during the renovation. The diary, written by one of Dr. Reed's assistants, detailed the extent of the experiments and the growing madness that had consumed Reed in his final days. The assistant had documented everything: the patient's suffering, the doctor's increasing paranoia, and the final, horrific experiment that had ended it all. The last entry, John said, was about an experiment that went wrong. Horribly wrong. Reed had found a way, or so he thought, to transfer consciousness from one body to another. But something went awry. Instead of prolonging life, the experiment trapped the souls of the patients in the walls of the basement. Their spirits, their agony, they're still down there, trapped in a nightmare they can never escape. The room fell silent, the gravity of John's words settling over them like a heavy fog. The whispers, the cold spots, the unsettling sense of being watched. All of it made sense now. The basement wasn't just haunted. It was a prison, holding the tormented souls of those who had suffered at Dr. Reed's hands. Lisa felt a chill run down her spine. She glanced around at the others, seeing the same fear reflected in their eyes. They had come in search of answers, but the truth was far worse than anything they could have imagined. The spirits of St. Mary's were not simply restless. They were victims, trapped by the cruelty of a man who had played God and failed. And now, decades later, they were reaching out, their pain reverberating through time, echoing in the walls of the hospital. But the worst was yet to come. As the group dispersed, each person left with a growing sense of dread. The knowledge of the hospital's dark past was a burden, one that weighed heavily on their minds. Lisa, in particular, couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to happen, something terrible. The whispers had started as a faint murmur, but now they were growing louder, more insistent, as if the spirits knew they had been discovered. And they weren't done yet. The unease at St. Mary's deepened, seeping into the very fabric of the hospital. Day by day, the atmosphere grew heavier, the air thick with tension and fear. Staff who had once prided themselves on their professionalism now found themselves jittery, distracted, their nerves frayed by the constant whispers that seemed to follow them wherever they went. Patients, too, began to complain, their faces pale and drawn as they spoke of voices in the dark, unseen presences that watched them from the corners of their rooms. No one could ignore it any longer. Something malevolent had taken hold of the hospital, something born from the horrific past buried in its walls. Lisa Thompson, the nurse who had helped uncover the hospital's grim history, found herself particularly affected. The knowledge of what had happened in the basement haunted her, invading her thoughts during the day and her dreams at night. The more she tried to distance herself from the growing madness around her, the more it seemed to pull her in. Sleep became elusive, and when it did come, it brought with it nightmares of cold, dark corridors and the cries of the lost souls trapped below. She could hear their voices even when she was awake now, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing hour. One night, after another grueling shift, Lisa returned to her small apartment, her mind heavy with exhaustion. The city outside her window was alive with the sounds of nightlife, but inside, her world had shrunk to the confines of her own fears. She tried to distract herself, turning on the television, flipping through channels, but nothing could drown out the whispering. It was always there, just at the edge of hearing, beckoning her, pulling her back to the hospital. It was around midnight when she finally gave in. Something deep inside her, a mixture of curiosity and a desperate need for answers, drove her to return to St. Mary's. She knew she shouldn't go back, not at this hour, not with the hospital's shadows growing longer and the whispers more persistent. But she couldn't help herself. She needed to see the basement again, needed to confront whatever was down there, even if it meant facing the darkest part of the hospital's history, in her own mind. The hospital was eerily quiet as she walked through its halls, her footsteps echoing unnervingly in the silence. The staff on duty barely acknowledged her presence, their eyes glazed over, lost in their own private battles with the growing madness. Lisa felt a pang of pity for them, but she kept moving, driven by the insistent pull of the whispers. They seemed to guide her now, directing her steps toward the basement, where the darkness was thickest. As she reached the door to the basement, Lisa hesitated. The cold draft emanating from the stairs chilled her to the bone, and for a moment, she considered turning back. But the whispers grew louder, almost impatient, as if they were waiting for her. She took a deep breath, steeling herself, and opened the door. The stairwell loomed before her, a gaping maw of darkness that seemed to swallow the light. She descended slowly, each step sending a jolt of fear through her body. The air grew colder the deeper she went, and the whispers grew more coherent, their words twisting together in a haunting litany of pain and despair. The basement was as she remembered it, cold, damp, and filled with the remnants of the hospital's past. But now it felt more alive, as if the very walls were pulsing with the anguish of those trapped within. Lisa's flashlight flickered as she reached the bottom of the stairs, casting erratic shadows that danced along the walls. She could feel the presence of the spirits around her, pressing in on her, their voices now clear and unmistakable. "Why did you come back?" One voice whispered, filled with sorrow. "You shouldn't be here," another hissed, angry and desperate. But one voice, clearer and more forceful than the others, cut through the cacophony. It was the voice of a young woman, filled with a quiet, intense pain. "You need to know," the voice said, seeming to come from all around her. "You need to see what they did." Suddenly, the temperature plummeted, and the light from Lisa's flashlight died, plunging her into complete darkness. Panic surged through her, but before she could move, a new light appeared. A faint, ethereal glow that illuminated the basement in a ghostly hue. The walls around her began to change, shifting and warping, as if time itself was unraveling. The present faded away, and in its place, the past came rushing back, vivid and horrifying. Lisa found herself standing in a different version of the basement, one that existed decades earlier, during the time of Dr. Reed's experiments. The room was filled with crude medical equipment, metal tables stained with blood, and the sickly sweet smell of decay. Figures moved through the space, doctors and nurses, their faces blank, their movements mechanical, as they performed unspeakable acts on the patients strapped to the tables. The patients, some unconscious, others wide-eyed with terror, were subjected to unimaginable horrors. Needles, scalpels, and other instruments of torture gleamed in the dim light, their purpose clear. Lisa tried to look away, but her body was frozen in place, forced to witness the atrocities. She could feel the despair of the patients, their fear and pain so palpable that it overwhelmed her senses. The whispers had turned into screams now, cries for mercy, for release, for death. It was a vision of hell, a nightmare brought to life by the tortured souls who had been trapped here. And then she saw him, Dr. Jonathan Reed, standing in the center of the chaos, his eyes alight with a maniacal fervor. He was a tall, gaunt figure, his face a mask of cold determination as he directed his assistants, ignoring the suffering around him. To him, the patients were nothing more than subjects, tools to be used and discarded in his quest for immortality. There was no humanity in his gaze, only the cold, calculating madness of a man who believed he could conquer death. But there was something else in the room, something that didn't belong, a dark, amorphous presence that seemed to hover just at the edge of the light. It pulsed with malevolent energy, feeding off the pain and fear, growing stronger with each scream, each drop of blood spilled. Lisa realized with a start that this entity, whatever it was, had been born from the very experiments Reed had conducted. It was the embodiment of the horror, the darkness that had festered in the basement for all these years. The vision began to fade, but the presence remained, its eyes, or what passed for eyes, locked onto Lisa. It was aware of her, and it was hungry. The whispers returned, no longer pleading, but demanding. "Free us," they chanted. "Free us from this place." The light snapped off, and Lisa was plunged back into the present, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The basement was dark and silent once more, but the terror lingered, a heavy weight in the pit of her stomach. She knew now what the whispers were, what they wanted, but she also knew that to free them, she would have to confront the evil that had taken root in St. Mary's, an evil that was very much alive and growing stronger with each passing day. Trembling, Lisa made her way back up the stairs, her mind reeling. The past had revealed itself to her, but it had also issued a warning. The darkness that Dr. Reed had unleashed was still here, lurking in the shadows, feeding off the fear and suffering of the living. And unless something was done, it would continue to grow, until it consumed everyone and everything within the hospital's walls. As she stepped into the cold, sterile light of the hospital corridors, Lisa knew there was no turning back. The spirits of St. Mary's had chosen her for a reason. They had shown her the truth, and now it was up to her to end the nightmare that had haunted the hospital for so long. But how could she, a simple nurse, fight against a darkness so profound, so deeply ingrained in the very foundations of the building? The answer eluded her, but she knew one thing for certain. The whispers wouldn't stop, the darkness wouldn't rest, until St. Mary's was cleansed of the evil that had been festering in its heart for decades. Lisa Thompson's encounter in the basement left her shaken, her mind haunted by the vision of Dr. Reed's experiments and the malevolent presence that had taken root in St. Mary's Hospital. The whispers followed her everywhere now, no longer confined to the dark corners of the hospital. They echoed in her apartment, in the streets, even in her dreams, where the faces of the tortured patients stared at her with hollow eyes, silently pleading for release. Sleep became an impossibility, and every shadow seemed to harbor something sinister, waiting to strike. Despite her fear, Lisa knew she couldn't ignore the spirit's plea. The horrors of St. Mary's needed to be confronted, and she was the only one who had seen the truth. But where to begin? The hospital was a labyrinth of secrets, its walls steeped in decades of pain and suffering. And worse, Lisa felt the weight of the entity she had sensed in the basement, the dark force that fed on the misery within the hospital. She could feel its influence spreading, its tendrils creeping into every corner of St. Mary's, growing stronger as the fear among the staff and patients intensified. Returning to work the next day, Lisa was greeted by a palpable sense of dread. The hospital, once a place of healing, had transformed into something unrecognizable. The halls were emptier, quieter, as if even the walls were holding their breath. The few staff members she encountered were visibly on edge, their eyes darting nervously, as though expecting something terrible to happen at any moment. It was clear that the events of the past few days had taken a toll on everyone. Lisa made her way to the nurse's station, where she found Dr. Turner slumped in a chair, his usually composed demeanor shattered. His hands trembled as he clutched a cup of coffee, his eyes bloodshot and haunted. Lisa approached him cautiously, unsure of how to broach the subject of what she had seen. But before she could speak, Dr. Turner looked up at her, his expression one of deep despair. "They're everywhere now," he said quietly, his voice strained. "I can hear them even when I'm not in the basement. They're in the operating rooms, the patient wards. They won't leave me alone." Lisa felt a chill run down her spine. Dr. Turner's words confirmed her worst fears. The spirits were no longer confined to the basement. Whatever had been unleashed was spreading, its influence growing more pervasive by the hour. She leaned in closer, lowering her voice. "I saw something last night," Lisa whispered, her eyes darting around to ensure no one was listening. "In the basement. It wasn't just the spirits. There's something else down there, something dark. I think it's responsible for all of this." Dr. Turner's face paled further, and he set his coffee down, his hands shaking too much to hold it. "I've felt it too," he admitted, his voice barely audible. "But I don't know what to do. This is beyond anything we've ever dealt with. We're doctors, nurses. How do we fight something like this?" Lisa didn't have an answer. The situation seemed hopeless, but she knew they couldn't simply do nothing. The darkness that had taken root in St. Mary's wouldn't stop until it consumed everyone. They had to find a way to stop it, but first they needed more information. That night, Lisa and Dr. Turner stayed late, poring over old hospital records in the hopes of uncovering something. Anything that could help them understand what they were up against. The records room was a cold, dimly lit space, filled with row after row of dusty files and forgotten documents. As they searched through the yellowed pages, the minutes ticked by, the only sound the rustling of paper and the occasional creak of the floorboards overhead. Hours passed with little progress. Most of the records from Dr. Reed's time had been destroyed or sealed away, leaving them with only fragmented pieces of the hospital's history. But just as they were about to give up, Lisa came across an old, leather-bound journal tucked away in a forgotten drawer. The name on the cover sent a shiver down her spine: Dr. Jonathan Reed. She opened the journal with trembling hands, the pages brittle with age. Inside, she found detailed notes on Reed's experiments, written in a precise, almost obsessive hand. The entries grew darker as they progressed, revealing the doctor's descent into madness. He wrote of his desire to conquer death, his belief that he could unlock the secrets of immortality by transferring human consciousness from one body to another. But as the experiments failed, Reed's desperation grew, and his methods became increasingly cruel and inhumane. But it was the final entry that truly terrified Lisa. In it, Reed wrote of his last experiment, one he believed would finally succeed. He described a ritual he had discovered in an ancient text, a method to bind the souls of the dying to the hospital itself, using their life force to fuel his experiments. But something had gone wrong, terribly wrong. Instead of granting him the power he sought, the ritual had unleashed a dark entity, a malevolent force that fed on the suffering of the patients. Reed's last words were a frantic scrawl, warning of the entity's insatiable hunger and begging whoever found the journal to destroy it before it could consume more lives. Lisa and Dr. Turner exchanged horrified looks as they finished reading. The ritual, the entity, it was all real, and it was still here, growing stronger with each passing day. The hospital had become a feeding ground for the darkness, and the spirits of the patients were trapped, their torment fueling the entity's power. "We need to stop this," Lisa said, her voice trembling with fear but also determination. "We can't let it continue." "But how?" Dr. Turner asked, his voice tinged with despair. "Reed's notes don't say how to stop it. They only warn of what will happen if we don't." Lisa's mind raced as she tried to think of a solution. They were doctors and nurses, trained to heal the living, not to fight the supernatural. But as she stared at the journal in her hands, an idea began to form. The ritual had bound the spirits to the hospital, trapping them in a cycle of pain and suffering. Perhaps if they could reverse the ritual or perform a new one, they could free the spirits and weaken the entity. "We need to find the ritual," Lisa said, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her. "If we can undo what Reed did, we might be able to stop this." Dr. Turner looked at her with a mix of hope and dread. "Do you think it's possible?" "I don't know," Lisa admitted. "But we have to try. We don't have any other choice." The plan was set, though it filled them both with a deep sense of foreboding. They would search the hospital for any remaining traces of Dr. Reed's work, looking for the ritual or any clues that could help them understand how to reverse it. But they knew they were racing against time. The entity was growing stronger, and with every life it touched, its power would only increase. As they prepared to leave the records room, a sudden coldness enveloped them, and the lights flickered ominously. The whispers returned, louder and more insistent than ever, echoing through the room in a chorus of anguish and despair. Lisa and Dr. Turner exchanged a look of mutual understanding. They were being watched, and whatever was in the hospital knew they were onto it. The darkness was closing in, and the fight for St. Mary's had only just begun. The days that followed were a blur of fear and determination as Lisa and Dr. Turner delved deeper into the secrets of St. Mary's Hospital. Every corner of the building seemed to pulse with malevolent energy, the walls themselves echoing with the cries of the trapped souls. The staff had become increasingly disoriented, their once routine tasks now fraught with anxiety. The few patients who hadn't yet been transferred or discharged due to the growing disturbances were visibly shaken, their eyes wide with terror, as if they could sense the darkness creeping ever closer. Lisa and Dr. Turner spent every waking hour searching for the remnants of Dr. Reed's ritual. They combed through forgotten rooms, pried open locked cabinets, and sifted through piles of dusty, neglected files. Each discovery, no matter how small, felt like a victory, though it was always tinged with a sense of impending doom. They knew that time was running out. The entity was becoming bolder, more aggressive, as if it knew they were working against it. One evening, after hours of searching, Lisa found herself standing before an old storage room deep within the hospital's basement. The door was heavy and rusted, the air around it thick with the smell of mildew and decay. Something about the room felt wrong, as if it had been sealed off for a reason. Her heart pounded in her chest as she hesitated, the whispers in her mind growing louder, urging her to turn back. But she couldn't. She had come too far, and the answers they sought could be inside. Summoning her courage, Lisa pushed open the door, the hinges groaning in protest. The room beyond was dark, the only light coming from the faint, flickering bulb overhead. Dust motes danced in the air as she stepped inside, her flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The room was filled with old equipment, forgotten medical tools, and boxes of unmarked files. But it was the large, ornate cabinet in the corner that caught her attention. It was out of place in the sterile environment of the hospital, its dark wood intricately carved with strange symbols that made Lisa's skin crawl. As she approached the cabinet, Lisa felt a deep sense of dread wash over her. The whispers intensified, swirling around her like a storm, but she forced herself to continue. Her hands trembled as she reached for the cabinet's doors, the cold metal handles sending a shock through her fingers. With a deep breath, she pulled the doors open, revealing a collection of old books, jars filled with strange substances, and a bundle of yellowed papers tied together with fraying twine. Lisa carefully untied the bundle, her breath catching in her throat as she unwrapped the papers. The handwriting was unmistakable. Dr. Reed's meticulous script filled the pages, detailing the ritual he had performed all those years ago. But as Lisa read through the notes, her horror deepened. The ritual had been more than just a means to bind the souls of the dying. It had been an attempt to merge the physical and spiritual realms, to create a conduit through which the entity could enter the world. Dr. Reed had believed that by harnessing the power of death itself, he could transcend the limitations of human existence. But in his arrogance, he had underestimated the darkness he was dealing with. The entity he had summoned was not just a byproduct of his experiments. It was something ancient, something that had been waiting in the shadows for the right moment to emerge. Reed's ritual had torn open a rift between worlds, and the entity had used it to anchor itself to the hospital, feeding off the suffering and despair of those trapped within its walls. The final pages of Reed's notes were a frantic scrawl, detailing his failed attempts to reverse the ritual. He had realized too late that the entity was far more powerful than he had anticipated, its presence warping the very fabric of reality around it. In his desperation, Reed had tried to sever the connection, to close the rift and banish the entity back to whatever hellish dimension it had come from. But the ritual had already taken on a life of its own, and Reed's efforts had only served to strengthen the entity's hold on the hospital. As Lisa absorbed the full extent of Reed's madness, a cold sweat broke out on her skin. The entity wasn't just an evil force. It was a living, breathing thing with a hunger that could never be sated. It was intelligent, calculating, and it knew that Lisa and Dr. Turner were trying to stop it. But worst of all, Reed's notes offered no clear solution, no way to reverse the damage that had been done. The ritual had created a bond between the entity and the hospital, a bond that seemed impossible to break. Despair settled over Lisa like a heavy fog, but she forced herself to keep reading. There had to be something, some clue that Reed had missed in his final, desperate hours. And then she saw it, a single, scribbled note in the margin of one of the pages, almost an afterthought. It spoke of a counter-ritual, something Reed had briefly considered but never attempted. The details were sparse, but it involved a purging fire, a cleansing of the space where the original ritual had been performed. The fire, according to the note, could sever the connection between the entity and the hospital, forcing it back into the void. But the note also came with a dire warning. The fire would have to be ignited in the very heart of the ritual, in the same place where the entity was strongest. It would be dangerous, possibly fatal, to those who attempted it, and there was no guarantee it would work. If the fire didn't burn hot enough, or if the ritual wasn't performed exactly as described, the entity could lash out in its final moments, taking its revenge on those who dared to challenge it. Lisa's hands shook as she finished reading. The counter-ritual was a gamble, a last-ditch effort to undo the horrors that had been unleashed. But it was their only chance. She folded the notes carefully, tucking them into her pocket, and made her way back to Dr. Turner. She found him in one of the abandoned patient rooms, his face etched with worry as he pored over another set of documents. "We have a plan," Lisa said, her voice barely above a whisper as she handed him the notes. Dr. Turner's eyes widened as he read through them, his expression shifting from disbelief to grim determination. "It's risky," he said, looking up at her, "but it might be our only shot." Lisa nodded, her resolve hardening. The fire might be dangerous, but it was a risk they had to take. The alternative, allowing the entity to continue its reign of terror, was unthinkable. They spent the rest of the night preparing for the ritual, gathering the materials they would need, and going over the steps again and again. Every moment was filled with a sense of urgency, as if the very walls of the hospital were closing in on them. The whispers were constant now, louder than ever, filling their minds with fear and doubt. But Lisa refused to let them take hold. She knew the spirits were watching, waiting to see if she and Dr. Turner could succeed where Dr. Reed had failed. As dawn approached, they made their way back to the basement, the air around them heavy with anticipation. The entity was there, waiting for them, its presence pressing down on them like a physical weight. But Lisa and Dr. Turner pushed forward, determined to see the ritual through to the end. They entered the room where the original ritual had been performed, the atmosphere thick with the stench of decay and old blood. The symbols carved into the floor still pulsed with a sickly, unnatural light, as if the ritual had never truly ended. Lisa felt a wave of nausea wash over her, but she forced it down, focusing on the task at hand. They arranged the materials in a circle around the symbols, following the instructions from Reed's notes to the letter. Every step had to be perfect, every word of the incantation spoken with absolute precision. As they worked, the temperature in the room dropped, and the shadows seemed to lengthen, closing in around them. The entity was watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. With everything in place, Lisa took a deep breath and struck the match, the flame flickering weakly in the cold air. For a moment, nothing happened, and a cold dread filled her chest. But then the fire caught, spreading rapidly across the circle, the flames growing higher and hotter with each passing second. The symbols on the floor flared up, glowing with an intense light as the fire consumed them. The entity reacted immediately, the room shaking as its fury was unleashed. The whispers turned into screams, the air around them vibrating with the force of the entity's rage. Lisa and Dr. Turner braced themselves as the fire reached its peak, the flames roaring as they devoured everything in their path. The light from the symbols intensified, and for a moment, it seemed as if the very fabric of reality was tearing apart. But then, as suddenly as it had begun, the fire died out, the flames extinguishing in an instant. The room was plunged into darkness, the oppressive weight of the entity lifting, leaving behind an eerie silence. Lisa and Dr. Turner stood frozen, their hearts pounding in their chests as they waited for something, anything to happen. And then they heard it, a low, mournful wail, rising up from the very depths of the hospital. It was the sound of the entity being forced back, its connection to the hospital severed at last. The walls around them shuddered, and the temperature began to rise, the cold dissipating as the last remnants of the ritual's power faded away. Lisa let out a breath she didn't realize she had been holding, her body trembling with exhaustion and relief. It was over. The entity was gone, its hold on St. Mary's broken. The spirits of the patients had been freed, their suffering finally brought to an end. But as she and Dr. Turner made their way back to the surface, Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that they had only just begun to understand the true depths of the darkness that had been unleashed. The hospital might be free for now, but the shadows would always be there, lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to return. The days following the ritual were eerily quiet at St. Mary's Hospital. The oppressive weight that had clung to the halls was gone, and the air felt lighter, as though the very building had been purged of its malevolent presence. The staff, while still shaken, began to show signs of recovery. Patients who had been paralyzed by fear slowly returned to a semblance of normalcy. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the hospital seemed to be at peace. Lisa Thompson and Dr. Turner were hailed as heroes by those who knew the truth. Their colleagues, though not fully aware of the supernatural horrors that had transpired, sensed that something profound had changed. Dr. Turner, who had always been a man of science, found himself grappling with the reality of what they had faced. The experience had left a mark on him, one that would not easily fade. Lisa, too, was forever altered by the ordeal, but she found solace in the knowledge that the spirits of the tortured patients were finally at rest. Despite the apparent calm, Lisa couldn't shake the lingering unease that gnawed at the edges of her consciousness. She had expected to feel relief after the entity was banished, but instead, there was a nagging sensation that something was still wrong, as if the ritual had only temporarily subdued the darkness. She found herself on edge, her senses heightened, as if she were constantly waiting for the other shoe to drop. The nightmares returned with a vengeance, more vivid and terrifying than before. Each night, Lisa was plunged back into the twisted corridors of St. Mary's, where the walls bled and the shadows moved with a life of their own. In her dreams, she was always alone, the whispers surrounding her like a suffocating fog. The spirits she had sought to save appeared before her, their hollow eyes accusing, their mouths twisted into silent screams. And always, lurking just beyond her vision, was the entity, its presence a dark, formless mass that radiated malevolence. Lisa's exhaustion grew with each passing day, the lack of sleep taking its toll on her mind and body. She became jumpy, paranoid, her nerves frayed to the breaking point. Every creak of the floorboards, every flicker of the lights, sent her heart racing. She tried to tell herself that it was just her imagination, that the entity was gone, but deep down, she knew the truth. The ritual had not been a complete success. One evening, after a particularly grueling shift, Lisa found herself wandering the hospital corridors long after her shift had ended. She told herself she was just checking on the patients, but in reality, she was looking for something, anything, that could confirm her suspicions. The hospital felt different at night, the darkness amplifying her fears. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows on the walls, and the silence was broken only by the occasional beep of a heart monitor or the distant sound of a door closing. As she walked past the old records room, a sudden chill washed over her, and she stopped in her tracks. The door was slightly ajar, a thin sliver of darkness visible through the gap. Lisa's heart pounded in her chest as she approached the door, her hand trembling as she reached out to push it open. The room beyond was pitch black, the light switch failing to respond when she flicked it on. Her flashlight barely pierced the darkness, the beam flickering as she swept it across the room. It was empty, just as they had left it after their search for Dr. Reed's notes. But something felt off, a sense of wrongness that made the hairs on the back of Lisa's neck stand on end. She took a step inside, her breath hitching as the door creaked shut behind her. The air was cold, much colder than the rest of the hospital, and it carried a faint, metallic scent that Lisa recognized all too well: blood. She moved further into the room, her footsteps echoing in the stillness. The flashlight beam wavered, her grip on the handle tightening as she fought to steady her hands. In the center of the room, where they had left the remnants of the ritual, the symbols carved into the floor were barely visible, their edges blurred as if the stone itself had started to heal. But as Lisa approached, the beam of her flashlight revealed something that made her blood run cold. The symbols were glowing again, a faint, sickly light pulsing from within the grooves. Lisa's breath caught in her throat as she watched, unable to tear her eyes away. The light grew stronger, more insistent, as if the ritual was trying to reignite itself. Panic surged through her, but before she could react, the whispers returned, louder, more malevolent than ever. They surrounded her, pressing in on all sides, the voices overlapping in a cacophony of hatred and despair. "You fail." The words were clear, cutting through the noise like a knife. Lisa stumbled back, her flashlight clattering to the floor, the beam spinning wildly as it rolled away. She was plunged into darkness, the whispers closing in, the air thick with their malice. She fumbled for the light, her fingers brushing against something cold and wet. When she pulled her hand back, it was covered in blood. The door slammed shut with a deafening crash, and the room plunged into silence. Lisa was frozen, her heart pounding in her ears. For what felt like an eternity, she stood there, her breath coming in shallow gasps, the darkness pressing in around her. And then, slowly, the whispers began to fade, the oppressive weight lifting slightly. With trembling hands, Lisa retrieved her flashlight, the beam illuminating the blood smeared across the floor. The symbols were no longer glowing, but the sense of dread remained, a constant, gnawing presence in the back of her mind. She stumbled out of the room, her breath coming in ragged sobs as she fled down the corridor. The hospital seemed to close in around her, the walls narrowing, the shadows lengthening as she ran. By the time she reached the main lobby, Lisa was drenched in sweat, her hands shaking uncontrollably. She collapsed onto a bench, gasping for breath, her mind racing. The entity wasn't gone. It had never been gone. The ritual had failed, and now the darkness was returning, stronger than before. She couldn't stay there, not anymore. The hospital was no longer a place of healing. It was a prison, and the entity was its warden. But as Lisa sat there, her fear slowly giving way to resolve. She couldn't leave, not yet. The entity was still bound to the hospital, and if she left now, it would continue to feed on the fear and suffering of those trapped within its walls. She had to finish what she started. She had to find a way to truly destroy it, once and for all. Lisa stood up, her legs shaky but determined. She knew she couldn't do this alone. She needed help, someone who understood the darkness they were facing, someone who had seen what she had seen. Dr. Turner. He had been there with her, had witnessed the horrors firsthand. Together they might stand a chance. She made her way to Dr. Turner's office, the journey feeling longer than it should have, the hospital's corridors seeming to stretch on endlessly. When she finally reached his door, she hesitated, her hand hovering over the handle. What if he didn't believe her? What if he thought she was losing her mind? But she couldn't let those doubts stop her. She had to try. Lisa knocked, the sound echoing in the empty hallway. For a moment, there was no response, and her heart sank. But then she heard movement from inside, and the door creaked open. Dr. Turner stood there, his face pale and drawn, dark circles under his eyes. He looked as exhausted as Lisa felt. "Lisa," he said, his voice heavy with concern. "What's wrong?" "It's not over," Lisa whispered, her voice trembling. "The entity, it's still here. We didn't stop it. It's getting stronger, and I think it's coming for us." Dr. Turner's expression hardened, his eyes narrowing as he stepped aside to let her in. "Tell me everything." As Lisa recounted what had happened in the records room, Dr. Turner listened in silence, his face growing grimmer with each passing moment. When she finished, he nodded, his jaw set in determination. "We need to find a way to end this," he said, his voice resolute. "No more rituals, no more half measures. We need to destroy whatever's left of the entity's hold on this place." "But how?" Lisa asked, her voice laced with desperation. "We've already tried everything. What else can we do?" Dr. Turner was silent for a moment, his gaze distant as he considered their options. Finally, he looked at Lisa, his expression resolute. "There might be one more thing we can try," he said, his voice low. "But it's risky, more dangerous than anything we've done so far." Lisa nodded, her fear momentarily eclipsed by determination. "Whatever it takes, we have to end this, once and for all." As Dr. Turner outlined his plan, the weight of their task settled over them like a shroud. The calm that had followed the ritual was gone, replaced by the storm they knew was coming. The entity was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its moment to strike. And this time, it would stop at nothing to consume them. The plan was simple, but its execution would be anything but. Dr. Turner's research had uncovered an ancient ritual, one far more dangerous than the one they had performed before. This ritual was not about banishment. It was about total annihilation. It required them to confront the entity directly, to lure it out of the shadows and into the light where it could be destroyed. But the cost would be high. The ritual demanded a sacrifice, one that neither Lisa nor Dr. Turner was eager to make, but both knew was necessary. The night they chose was the darkest of the year, the moon hidden behind thick clouds that suffocated the sky. The hospital was silent, the patients and staff unaware of the battle that was about to take place beneath their feet. Lisa and Dr. Turner prepared in silence, their faces pale but determined. They gathered the ingredients needed for the ritual: candles, ancient symbols etched into stone, and a vial of blood drawn from each of them. The blood was the key, a binding agent that would tie them to the entity, forcing it to manifest in the physical realm. They made their way to the basement, where the remnants of the previous ritual still lingered like a bad dream. The air was thick with the scent of decay, the walls seeming to close in around them as they descended into the depths of the hospital. Each step felt heavier than the last, the oppressive atmosphere pressing down on them like a physical weight. When they reached the ritual site, Lisa felt a cold shiver run down her spine. The symbols on the floor were faintly glowing again, pulsating with a sickly, unnatural light. The entity was already aware of their presence. Dr. Turner arranged the candles in a precise pattern, his hands steady despite the fear that gnawed at the edges of his resolve. Lisa could see the strain in his eyes, the exhaustion from weeks of battling the unknown. But she also saw the determination, the refusal to let this entity claim any more lives. She mirrored his movements, placing her candles in the designated spots, and together they began to chant the ancient incantation. The words felt foreign on Lisa's tongue, harsh and guttural, like they didn't belong in this world. As they chanted, the temperature in the room dropped sharply, their breath visible in the frigid air. The shadows around them began to move, swirling and coalescing into a dark mass that hovered at the edge of the circle they had drawn. The entity was coming, drawn by the power of the ritual, its presence a palpable force that made the walls tremble. Lisa's heart pounded in her chest as the darkness thickened, the mass of shadows beginning to take form. It was an abomination, a twisted amalgamation of the suffering it had consumed over the years. Faces emerged from the blackness, twisted in eternal torment, their eyes hollow and accusing. The whispers began again, louder this time, a cacophony of pain and rage that threatened to drown out their chanting. Lisa's voice faltered, her fear threatening to overwhelm her, but Dr. Turner's steady tone kept her grounded. The entity lashed out, testing the boundaries of the circle, but the ritual held strong. The light from the candles intensified, pushing the darkness back, forcing the entity to manifest fully. It resisted, the shadows writhing and twisting as it tried to maintain its hold on the hospital. But the ritual's power was undeniable, and slowly, painfully, the entity began to take shape. What emerged from the darkness was a monstrous figure, its body an ever-shifting mass of shadow and suffering. It had no face, only a gaping void where its eyes should have been, and yet Lisa could feel its gaze boring into her, its hatred palpable. Dr. Turner continued the incantation, his voice rising above the din of whispers. The entity recoiled, its form flickering as if it were struggling to maintain its cohesion. The light from the candles grew brighter, the flames stretching toward the creature as if they were alive, seeking to consume it. But the entity was not so easily defeated. With a roar that shook the very foundations of the hospital, it lashed out, a tendril of shadow, striking Dr. Turner and sending him crashing to the ground. Lisa screamed, her concentration breaking as she rushed to his side. Dr. Turner was alive, but barely, his breathing shallow and labored. The tendril of darkness had left a mark on him, a wound that seeped in inky blackness, as if the entity had infected him with its corruption. He looked up at Lisa, his eyes filled with pain, but also with determination. "You have to finish it," he gasped, his voice weak but insistent. "You're the only one who can." Tears welled in Lisa's eyes as she nodded, her hands trembling as she picked up the ritual where Dr. Turner had left off. The entity howled in rage, its form flickering as it tried to push past the circle's boundaries. But Lisa held firm, her voice steady as she chanted the final words of the incantation. The candles flared one last time, their flames reaching impossibly high before they exploded in a blinding flash of light. The entity shrieked, its form unraveling as the light consumed it, the shadows dissipating like smoke in the wind. The faces twisted and torment faded, their expressions finally at peace as they were released from the entity's grasp. The darkness that had plagued St. Mary's for so long was being obliterated, torn apart by the ritual's power. But as the light began to fade, Lisa realized something was wrong. The entity wasn't being destroyed. It was being drawn into the circle, into the stone where the symbols had been carved. The ritual wasn't annihilating the entity. It was binding it, trapping it within the stone, where it would remain imprisoned for eternity. Lisa's heart sank as she understood the true cost of the ritual. The entity would be contained, but its influence would never be truly gone. The stone would become its prison, and it would take someone's life force to seal the bond. Dr. Turner, sensing the same realization, struggled to his feet, his face pale and drawn. "It has to be done," he whispered, his voice filled with resignation. "This is the only way." Lisa shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No, there has to be another way. We can't." "There isn't," Dr. Turner interrupted, his voice firm despite the pain. He reached out, taking Lisa's hand in his grip surprisingly strong. "You have to live, Lisa. You're the only one who can tell the world what happened here, to make sure it never happens again." Before Lisa could protest, Dr. Turner stepped into the center of the circle, placing his hand on the stone. The symbols flared to life, the light burning brighter than ever before. The entity's shrieks grew louder, more desperate, as it was pulled into the stone, its form twisting and writhing in agony. The light consumed Dr. Turner as well, his body trembling as the ritual took hold, draining his life force to complete the binding. Lisa watched in horror as Dr. Turner's form began to fade, his features softening as the light enveloped him. He looked at her one last time, a faint smile on his lips. "It's okay," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the roar of the ritual. "It's over." With those final words, Dr. Turner was gone, his body dissolving into the light as the entity was sealed within the stone. The light pulsed one last time, then faded, leaving the room in darkness. The silence that followed was deafening. The oppressive weight that had hung over the hospital for so long finally lifted. Lisa stood there for a long moment, her mind numb with grief and exhaustion. The stone lay in the center of the circle, cold and lifeless, the symbols etched into its surface glowing faintly in the dim light. The entity was gone, its malevolent presence finally extinguished, but at a terrible cost. Tears streamed down Lisa's face as she fell to her knees beside the stone, her body shaking with sobs. She had survived, but the victory felt hollow, the weight of Dr. Turner's sacrifice heavy on her heart. She had won, but at what price? As dawn broke over St. Mary's, the first rays of sunlight filtering through the basement windows, Lisa made her way back to the surface. The hospital was quiet, the staff and patients blissfully unaware of the battle that had taken place beneath their feet. But Lisa knew she would never forget. The darkness had been vanquished, but the scars it left behind would never fully heal. Lisa left the hospital that morning, the stone wrapped in a cloth and clutched tightly in her hands. She didn't know what she would do with it, only that she had to keep it safe, to ensure that the entity could never escape its prison. As she walked away from St. Mary's, the sun rising behind her, Lisa knew that the fight was not over. The shadows might be gone for now, but the memory of what had happened there would haunt her forever. And somewhere, deep within the stone, the entity waited, its hatred undimmed, biding its time until the day it could break free once more.